Tonight on Talking Politics, the Mass legislature isn't known for its speed, but right now it's moving slower than it has in decades. In a few minutes, we'll look at why and at the big things that are not getting done. But first, no, it isn't your imagination. Driving habits have gotten worse over the past few years in Boston and everywhere else, and it's taking a serious toll. The U.S. Department of Transportation says roadway fatalities are on the rise again after years of decline, with more than 42,000 people killed in both 2021 and 2022. Level's Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg calls a national crisis. That tally includes drivers, but also cyclists and pedestrians who are especially vulnerable. According to the advocacy group WalkMassachusetts, at least 101 pedestrians were killed in the state just last year. That is the backdrop for a new push by the city of Boston to make its streets safer, an effort Mayor Michelle Wu rolled out last week.
Our streets team has developed a plan to roll out speed humps through a new zone-based approach.
That's just one part of the city's new so-called safety surge. So how exactly will it work, and what else can and should be done in Boston and elsewhere to keep more people from being needlessly killed? I'm joined now by Brendan Kearney, the Deputy Director of WalkMassachusetts, and Stacy Thompson, Executive Director of Livable Streets. Thank you both for being here. Brendan, in the study that you did on fatalities in 2022, you and your colleagues identified some patterns. What are they?
So 101 pedestrians died across the state. They were in 60 different municipalities, so it's not just in big cities. 71% of those crashes were in environmental justice block groups, and 38% of them were older adults, so people over age 65.
And just to be clear, when you say environmental justice block groups, those tend to be neighborhoods that are poorer, more people of color, and more non-native English speakers, right?
Correct, and it's a lot of our historically redlined communities.
And is there any pattern that you're able to identify, or patterns involving the type of accidents that killed? I know accident is a term which is maybe I'm not supposed to use, maybe we can get to that. The types of collisions that killed the pedestrians who lost their lives, was it red lights being run, speeding, distracted driving, or is it difficult to
it's kind of all of the above,
okay.
But yeah, 10 of them were hit-and-run crashes where people left the scene of the collision. People were hitting crosswalks, people were hit walking along a roadway where there were no sidewalks, so it was kind of all of the above.
Before I get you to talk about what's happening in Boston, Stacy, I should say that the debate over whether to use the term accident, is it because that term is kind of exculpatory?
Yeah, I mean, often the example that is used is you would never say a plane accident, because if a plane crashes, there's a huge investigation to find out exactly what went wrong. And so we want to use that same terminology with a car crash.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So how will what the Wu administration is doing in Boston make the people who live there, pedestrians, cyclists, drivers, how will it make them safer?
Yeah, so quite simply, in every major urban area globally, the data shows that the fastest and most efficient way to slow down traffic is through roadway design. And there are tried and true methods. And what this new announcement from Boston does is focus on those simple interventions. They're looking at the whole city, breaking it into zones, and then over time taking it 10 zones a year, adding speed bumps, changing traffic signals to make it easier for people walking to move through intersections. And then they're using data to look at the most dangerous intersections and addressing those with traffic calming measures first. And those, again, are all roadway design measures that are tried and true.
Speed bumps or speed humps, I've been trying to figure out what the term of art is. Well, what are they, and what's Boston using, and what's the difference?
Yeah, so a speed bump and a speed hump is a size question. Okay. Speed bump is a little smaller, speed bump is a little wider, and then there's also the idea of a raised intersection, which is sort of the entire intersection is a little bit higher than the arterial. And the purpose of all of those is to force the vehicle to slow down, otherwise you'll bottom out. We've all had these experiences driving where the roadway changes and you got to slow down.
It's very effective, yeah. And the signals, could that mean, for example, you're automatically given a walk, a white walk light as the light stays red without having to press the button?
Yes, and it's also about giving pedestrians a few more seconds to get out into the intersection ahead of vehicles. Brendan is actually probably the state's expert in traffic signal policy.
Let's go to Brendan.
I guess I would be the expert that doesn't have an engineering degree. So there are many more people who have engineering degrees who are better on it.
So yeah, what are some of the things that could be done with
Yeah,
the signals?
and a lot of it is just making them make sense from intersection to intersection. There needs to be more consistency, especially if there is a street which is one way coming in and they have a red light. People walking should have a walk light to walk across that street. There's no conflict. So when the signals don't make sense to people, people just start walking when they feel it's safe.
You got to get across the street.
Exactly.
Is there anything? My sense is you're both pretty bullish on what Mayor Wu is doing, right? You like her ideas.
Absolutely.
Is there anything that is not in the city's plan? Just to try to get you to accentuate the negative for a moment. Is there anything that you would have liked to see there that didn't make it in?
Well, I mean, I think this really builds on that neighborhood slow streets plan, which was like making the case for adding speed humps in the city of Boston, which was super controversial. But
why was it controversial?
Because you might slow people down, which is what we're trying to do to increase safety here. So,
and what you see often is that people want other individuals to slow down in their neighborhood, but they want to be able to go as fast and move as quickly in their own neighborhood and not take responsibility that they might actually be one of the people causing the dangerous situations.
All right, I hadn't planned to ask the two of you this question, but it just occurred to me while we were talking about this. We have all made our lives here in the Boston area, but I believe that we're all from other places. Is there something about Massachusetts that makes an unusually large amount of people think that they just have a God-given right to drive as fast as they want, whatever the consequences might be? Like, is there something in the water here? Because I love it here. I'm here for a reason. Glad I'm raising my family here. Glad my kids are native Massachusetts residents. But there's something I'm struck by it frequently.
I will start because I'm from Minnesota and I like to talk about it. So I think contextually it's important to recognize that we are deeply concerned by the increase in fatalities in Massachusetts, but Massachusetts is actually strangely leading compared to other states.
Thank you for that.
The roadway conditions in Massachusetts tend to make it more challenging, and what I have observed is that poor signage, poor roadway construction can add to frustration and then add to that sort of reputation that folks drive poorly in Massachusetts. But in the same way that people sometimes get frustrated with cyclists, if the cyclist doesn't have a place to go, they're going to be in a place that someone driving or walking doesn't want them to be. And the same thing happens on our roadways. So I think it all comes down to good design, or a certain portion of it comes down to design.
I think it's that, and also I think here in Massachusetts, you know, I went to Holy Cross, so I've been here for 20 plus years. We're kind of resting on our laurels a little bit with, you know, the old bones of like small New England towns, and also just the small cow paths, and so much narrower streets. So like we're resting on that, and just like that has led to better outcomes for us. I think we need to continue to not rely on that, and you know, as vehicles are getting bigger, we need to be changing our roadways to make sure that we're slowing down those larger vehicles.
All right, let me ask another question of the two of you, and you can tackle it first, and then we'll go to you, Stacy. What could the state be doing? Because obviously what Boston is doing is interesting and could provide a model for other communities to follow, but they're just one municipality. What could the state be doing that it isn't doing right now?
So the state released a strategic highway safety plan this past January, which is a federal requirement. They have to do it every 5 years. Part of that, they say they want to, you know, release an action plan so they can actually identify like who within the state agencies are responsible and are going to follow through on making safer streets, like identifying where these serious crashes are and then providing money to municipalities to make fixes. That action plan has not been released yet. It's halfway through the year. So we really want to see an action plan to, you know, not just look at data, but actually make changes to the road.
Is that something that would require the legislature to actually pass a bill? We're talking in the next segment about how slow the legislature is starting this particular session. Would they need to act, or could the Healy administration just do this unilaterally?
The Healy administration could do this. MassDOT could do this. MassDOT already has mechanisms where they can make money and technical assistance available to cities and towns. They had a great program that they started during COVID called Shared Streets and Spaces. It made money available quickly to cities and towns with a easy to fill out application. And they also required photos from the municipality to show that it was done, and they had to do it within a very small time period. So things got done, things got made on the ground, which was super important.
Is there anything else you'd add on the state front?
Yeah, what I would note is that when you look at the numbers, our most dangerous roads are actually state-owned roads. So we focus a lot on the work that municipalities can do, and I completely agree with Brendan that the state should be offering more resources to municipalities, especially those that are smaller, that have fewer resources to make their roadways safer. But MassDOT roads and Department of Conservation and Recreation roads hold the most crashes in the state. And so the state has a responsibility to be using some of these tried and true design methods, again, to bring the crashes down on their own roads in addition to supporting municipalities.
When you say that, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just one other thing about, MassDOT's role here. Like, they also have been rethinking speed management and, like, what it means to set speeds and speed limits. And they claim that they're no longer as reliant on the 85th percentile to set speeds. The 85th percentile, do you know what that is?
No.
Because it's very confusing and simple at the same time. They look at a roadway over, an hour period of time, and they track the speed of 100 vehicles.
Okay.
And then they say, okay, this, the 85th percentile speed is this. So 15 of those vehicles are still going faster than that. And they're like, that's the new speed limit.
So they effectively let drivers determine what...
They design the road in a way to ensure that a certain percentage is speeding at all times.
So
That's wild.
it's absolutely insane.
I'm kind of reeling for the show.
Like, think about if you were giving out candy on Halloween and your kids were like, oh, I got 100 pieces of candy. You're like, whoa, you can't eat those many. They're like, no, we're going to do 85th percentile for candy.
It's
it's
counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Let me ask you both, and I'll start with you, and then I think you'll get the last word here. I'm really interested in the question of enforcement and what should be done or what should not be done. Every time I see someone plow through a red, usually at a high speed, maybe a couple seconds after it changed, and I see it a lot, I think two things. I wish that we had automated cameras like a lot of other states do. I paid a ticket in another state with one of those, and it changed my habits. And then I wish that there had been a police officer who was there who could pull them over for running a red so they didn't do it again. But if I understand it right, Livable Streets does not think that either police enforcement or automated enforcement are meaningful or helpful solutions in the long run, right?
It's a little more complicated than that. So in 2022, we released a report that looked at nationwide data. And the first step was we actually relied on the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, a much bigger organization that looked at police enforcement as it relates to traffic safety and reducing crashes across the country. They found no association, none, between traffic stops and actually saving lives. It didn't exist. Additionally, there have been studies that look at high visibility speed traps, and what they found is that within a week of the police officer leaving that intersection, behavior had gone back to what it was before. So what we know is not personal, it's that relying on police enforcement, the data doesn't show that it's effective.
And there's concerns about pretextual stops, right?
On top of
disproportionate racial impact.
Exactly. And then so what we say is, first and foremost, design is the most effective, and what municipalities and states should invest in. When it comes to automated enforcement, there is data that shows that on arterials and places where it's really hard to design, in some cases red lights, a camera enforcement might be appropriate, but it's really important to mark and indicate that a camera is there to keep the fines and fees low. There's a lot that goes into getting that right, and we recommend it as a last resort. Design first, and then if that doesn't do the trick, then a camera is your next option.
I read the report last night. I'll have to reread it because I didn't read it well enough. Is WalkMassachusetts, broadly speaking, on the same page as the
and we, there was a report that came out just before their report last year that was actually done by New York City DOT that looked at their own program of it, and they found that when people did get an automated enforcement ticket, 55% of them only got one. So like it did change the behavior. But then when they shut off the cameras because their legislature didn't reauthorize the program, people were speeding again. They kept the cameras on, just not issuing tickets.
Okay, Brendan Kearney, Stacy Thompson, thank you both.
Thank you.
Next up, 12 bills. That's all the Massachusetts State Legislature has passed so far in this session, which, according to a review from the Boston Globe, makes this perhaps the least productive start to a legislative session in at least 40 years. By their count, the legislature is 5 or more bills behind the pace of the last 2 legislative sessions and close to half that of the average from the past 2 decades for this point on the calendar. So why exactly are lawmakers falling behind this time around? And is it a problem? The Globe reporter behind the story, Matt Stout, joins me now, along with GBH News State House reporter Katie Landon. Thank you both for being here. Matt, how did you first get an inkling that the legislature is moving even more slowly this session than usual?
Basically, we try to do our best to track the bills, and it's something that's been sort of itching the back of my mind to the point where I'm like, well, what does it look like from past years? And then kept going back and back and back and could not find a year that there's been fewer at this point. And frankly, just stopped at 1983 because it would have been more and more the farther you went back.
It drives the point home, right?
Yeah,
4 decades is a long time. Katie, is this something that has been on your radar, maybe that people are talking about in the building or outside the building, or that you just sense in the daily rhythms of the State House?
Absolutely. We've seen very few formal sessions this year, even though, you know, we're kind of back at a full strength operation after a couple pandemic disrupted years with remote sessions. But you don't see a lot of the busy early lawmaking activity. There is usually a slow start at the beginning of the session as lawmakers are assigned to committees, move into new offices, kind of the logistical things like that. But this year you can really see that, you know, thinking back to the last couple of sessions, there were COVID response bills that needed to be done.
Oh, that's a good point, yeah.
There hasn't been, other than some movement we've seen on tax reform, and of course the budget takes up a lot of the early action, the state budget, you haven't seen much other policy moving. It still feels like things are getting up and running, even though, you know, the session began in January and now here we are in June.
Did people think it was going to be that way with the Democrats taking back the corner office after 8 years of Charlie Baker, or did they expect, and when I say people, I guess I'm talking Democratic legislators, was there a hope that with a Democrat controlling the governorship now, that they would just be sort of forging ahead with dispatch, getting all sorts of stuff done?
Yeah, I think there's kind of 2 schools of thought there, right? And one is that there are a lot of advocates who are more hopeful that having Maura Healey in their corner office, who might be more sympathetic to their causes, more of an ally than former Governor Baker was, that, yeah, things would move. You know, you saw items in her campaign platform that people have been pushing for years now. But the other side of that coin is that when you have a full slate of Democratic control, you have the governor, the House, and the Senate, there's not really as clear a one singular force to set the agenda.
Oh, that makes sense. Matt, when you talk to defenders of the way things are working right now, and you talk to a few of them, what was the case they made for why this is not problematic?
Well, as the argument always is, I mean, it's set up to be a deliberative body and moving fast, especially when you have a session that is technically they have 19 months to do formal lawmaking. They are not going to rush, even if everyone agrees there is a big problem here or a big problem there. They have the time to address, to mull, to talk, do hearings, and they take it. This like sort of slow and steady, deliberate approach, it's something the legislature has always sort of embraced. It's just even this year, it's to even a degree than we've even seen before.
You know, I should be careful here because if any former bosses of mine or current bosses of mine are watching this segment, they may end up reminding me in a little bit that I like to take as much time as I can to finish a given job. And as you point out, the legislature has a lot of time to finish their job. But I would have thought that this sense of anxiety around people leaving Massachusetts, which seems to be more acute right now than I can remember it being in the past couple of decades, I would have thought that that might shake things up a little bit and get lawmakers saying, okay, yes, technically we have 19 months to do this, but there are real pressing problems that are making people move out every day or making people lose their homes every day. We got to move a little quicker this time around, but that's not happening.
Well, there's a tendency in the legislature to want to address big problems with big bills. They don't move a lot of small things. If there's sort of this umbrella, you know, say it's housing, say it's Like they talk about competitiveness, which is sort of taking the form of the tax relief bill they're doing. They try to put a lot of different policy, a lot of different things into one big, which takes time, which, you know, I mean, and especially with the tax relief and sort of tax overhaul, that's eating up a lot of oxygen, and that's where those sort of like that energy has been. That hasn't been signed into law yet. We haven't even seen something from the Senate yet. But when you try and work through the budget, you're trying to work through that. I mean, that is taking up a lot of attention that essentially that is what they're working on behind the scenes.
And some of this stuff gets done in the budget, right? We should, since people, and I mean, you two are much more familiar with the sausage making process than I am, but it's worth reminding people at home, sometimes these big ideas get hashed out in the budget itself, right?
Yes, definitely. And actually, you've seen a trend in the legislature over the past several years, not just to work on these big comprehensive packages, but to get things passed by getting them into the budget, which has to be signed into law every year. So maybe rather than passing a bill on one policy, you see the Senate or the House added in as an amendment, and they can kind of trade things in budget negotiations and get it to the governor that way. So that's one, rather than individual bills, that's one way they do try to move things forward.
We've talked about a couple of them, but what are some of the other big issues that are kicking around Beacon Hill, big ideas, maybe big pieces of legislation that have yet to be passed because things are moving as slowly as they are? Do any ideas spring to mind in addition to what we've already touched on? I mean, one thing I think of is the legislation that was rolled out last year that would remake the way Massachusetts approaches early childhood care. That still hasn't become a reality, right?
I absolutely was going to mention that one because there was a legislative commission last session, and that's one of the things that Governor Reilly has signaled support for. And so a lot of people have been hoping for movement there, but it really is, we haven't, seen a hearing yet. We haven't.
There hasn't even been a hearing on that one yet?
The hearings are still getting up and running, and I might be wrong that that hasn't had a hearing, but I don't know, Matt, if one is on your radar. But
I'm not sure if there's one specifically on that.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been hearings. Some of them have just been sort of oversight hearings where they like talk to people, issue ideas, but they're not sorting through bills yet.
Right.
I mean, in terms of other issues, you have housing. Everyone is, what do we do on housing? And we don't really know what the legislature is going to do yet. We don't know the timing of any type of legislation to address that. It seems like there is an appetite to do something, some major sort of omnibus bill on that. I mean, there's other things left over from last session too. They in light of the Supreme Court last year addressing gun laws, there's a need to address and change the laws here to reflect that and perhaps update it. That's something they talked about at the end of last summer, like, oh, hey, we're gonna do that when it comes to the new session. We are 5-6 months in, and we haven't seen movement on that either, but that's something that is also on their plate, on their radar.
Katie, I want to ask you to compare the situation in Massachusetts to Minnesota, which is where I happen to grow up, although I've lived here longer than I ever lived there. But Democrats in Minnesota took control of the Senate and the House and the governorship. They controlled all branches of government after the 2022 elections. And they responded by kind of going crazy to start off 2023. They passed a whole bunch. I can't list everything they passed here, but free public college tuition for families that earn under $80,000, restoring voting rights to formerly incarcerated people, universal free school lunches, banning non-competes, a whole mess of stuff. President Obama sent out a tweet Twitter thread recently praising what they did. I'll just quote from it briefly. If you need a reminder elections have consequences, check out what's happening in Minnesota. Earlier this year, Democrats took control of the state Senate by 1 seat after winning a race by just 321 votes. He went on to say in a subsequent tweet, since then, Minnesota's made progress on a whole host of issues, from protecting abortion rights and new gun safety measures to expanding access to the ballot and reducing child poverty. Long wind-up to ask you, is part of the reason things are moving so slowly here in Massachusetts that there is no sense among Democrats that their control is imperiled moving forward? Because in Minnesota, there's a tradition of Republicans being competitive. And here we've got quite the opposite. And it's trending in the opposite direction. Is that one reason that Democrats are so slow to act on everything we've been talking about here?
Yeah, I think you could make the case that for, large swaths of the state legislature, elections just don't have consequences. If you look at the general election here, over the past couple cycles, there's something like a third of the 200 legislative seats have competition in the general. And that's, candidates of all stripes, serious contenders and people who are kind of running on a lower profile campaign. And then if you back it up to the primary, it's typically only about half that have any sort of competition. So in primary or general. So there's really not much that people do to show a dissatisfaction with this pace of the legislature. It remains to be seen if, you know, something this session could generate a serious competitive force. If there's a reaction, I think it's worth noting that one of the jobs of legislative leaders is to protect their members, to kind of insulate them from tough votes. They do a lot to drive consensus behind major policies, to pass bills near unanimously rather than on a tight margin. So I think the specter of competition hangs over the head of the legislature.
They can imagine it maybe being competitive one day and it's spooky.
Yeah, if you look at the idea of, you know, there's more Democrats in the House now than any session since 2009 before the Tea Party wave. And I think a lot of people remember being targeted with mailers, singling out specific votes, things like that. But, you know, by and large, incumbents get reelected in Massachusetts, and that's particularly true of Democrats.
So, Matt, we've talked about political competitiveness or the lack thereof. You mentioned the amount of time they have in each session. Are there any other factors, structural factors, that you think might account for what you described in your piece?
Yeah, I think a lot of the pressures, whether it be electoral or not, that exist other places don't exist here on a regular basis in Massachusetts. I mean, even, you know, when you looked at the previous 8 years with the Republican governor and this idea that even Charlie Baker ran on of creating this friction between the legislature and the administration, Republican administration.
Productive and civil, but generative.
And there was some truth to that. There was, I mean, there obviously was tension. I would say there was never tension between, you know, a Deval Patrick, a Democrat, and then a Democratic legislature. So I guess pick your issue and perhaps, you know, you find your evidence there. But yeah, even with this current iteration with Maura Healey has gone out of her way not to create friction with the legislature, praising them. You know, if things are moving slowly, she is not going to be the one to criticize them for that. I think as a new governor trying to settle in, but also create relationships, even if there were to be friction between all Democrats, it's not going to come from the corner office, at least as of now. At least what we have not seen in the last, you know, 5 months or so.
That's a really interesting contrast, because when I think back to the Patrick years, and my mind is, I'm old enough that the memories are dim, but he came in with his own strong ideas about how business should be done, and he was, even though he was a Democrat, like most other legislators, or most legislators, he was an outsider, and he ruffled a lot of feathers, right? And this is a completely different vibe right now. Yeah,
and you know, even though you know, Maura Healey has been in elected office statewide for 8 years before she's not an outsider by any means, especially compared to, you know, Deval Patrick. And I think she understands, and perhaps Deval Patrick is, you know, Democrats to look back of like, well, that's, you know, there's things to avoid that happened during his time. That I'm, you know, not to say that Maura Healey's just looking back at news clippings of Deval Patrick's time and trying to learn the ropes, but I think there's you need to, you know, create relationships and not try to, you know, create too much friction with the legislature, because ultimately your agenda needs them on board to get done. A lot of your agenda, because there's only so much you could do as an executive without the legislature behind you.
All right, Matt Stout, Katie Landon, thank you for talking this through. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for tonight, but do come back next week, and please tell us what you think. The email's talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website's gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics, or you can find me on Twitter. I'm @Reilly Adam. For now, thank you for watching, and good night.